Imagine that our support for defensive weapon systems to protect civilians from incoming fire would be linked to reforms, to quote unquote progressive reforms on abortion, same-sex marriage, and trans issues. It's really unbelievable. And when a Ukrainian government official asked me what they can do to push back against this, I said, there's nothing you can do. There's nothing.
This is complicated. John Zmirak is pretty clear when he comes on the program. That's what's going on over there, that we in America have kind of gotten sucked into this narrative that, like, Ukraine, they're heroes, they're pro-democracy, good guys, and Russia is evil. And John Zmirak and others I've had on the program have said, no, these are both very corrupt countries. What we do know is that the people there are suffering, and that's what we care about. But so what is your perspective in this article, and what's your perspective on the whole thing?
Yeah, well, I love when I get an opportunity to disagree with my closest friends. It proves that, we're not a herd animal like those on the woke left.
Yeah.
But, I don't feel like we've been sucked into anything. I feel we've pushed the people of Ukraine into something. And by we, I mean our establishment. The same folks that pushed the people of Afghanistan into something and then abandoned them. The same folks that sat on their hands while Sudan fell into civil war, then closed up the embassy and left American citizens behind. It's quite a neat little game that they play. So I see that the people of Ukraine have sort of been trapped by our corruption. We have the Burisma recordings. I mean, we have our president shaking down an energy company. It's really unbelievable. And my speech, which I thought, wow, I'm going to a war and I'm going to anger all sides. And my speech was just very clear. Do not let your country be a means to other ends, whether it's the military industrial complex. We're not sending money to Ukraine. We're sending money to Northern Virginia, from Northern Virginia, and they're sending weapons to Ukraine. And young Ukrainians are dying using those weapons, and young Russian boys too are dying. But my message to the people of Ukraine was, you're being invaded from two directions. This is Poland 2.0. You're being invaded from the west and by the east. The east is very barbaric. Of course, they're launching missiles at apartment buildings and Russian-made drones. They have a agreement of unlimited friendship with China. So from the east, it's China, Iran, and Russia invading them. And then from the west, you have the LGBT folks and pushing them to change their culture and their laws and their morals. I saw one rainbow flag the whole time I was in Ukraine, and that was at the Canadian embassy.
I mean, Jason, it's so sickening. I was talking about this earlier, that this is where I would say, principally thanks to John Zmirak, I've woken up to some things, because I have to say that, I mean, look, which is to say the United States of America, which used to be a force for good, has been using its power to push sexual license, to push this LGBTQ agenda, before that to push abortion, using its power to push these wicked things on weak, poor, vulnerable nations around the world. And what you're telling me, basically, is that is what is happening right now in the Ukraine, or that's what you're saying in the article. That's part of the story, is that we're using them to push this kind of globalist, pansexual agenda, which we've done for decades. It's sickening.
Yeah, and that's why people on the right want to make Putin out to be the good guy. Eric, I've spent a lot of time in war zones and conflict zones. And I remember the first time I went to Sudan during the genocide and I stepped off a plane, a buddy of mine said, Jason, you're an American, you're going to be looking for white hats and black hats. You're not going to find those here, not even on your own head. And so the desire to see Putin as some great liberating hero, we have to remember, first of all, he's waging a brutal war.
Well, wait a minute. I want to be clear. I certainly do not see him that way. I want to be very clear about that. In fact, really, my best take on it thus far is what you're saying. There are no white hats and black hats. This is just a mess. There's corruption, and the Biden administration, in its weakness, has allowed this to happen. It's my belief that if Trump were in the White House, none of this would be happening. So I want to be clear about that. But keep going.
Yeah, and it wouldn't happen for two reasons. One, Trump wouldn't go along with the ridiculous idea that Ukraine should be a part of NATO, which obviously is poking the bear.
All right, so you agree with that, because that's my view.
No,
It's like, I don't even understand, why would you do that? Why do you even have a NATO? And forgive me for interrupting, but I can never get my head around this. Why are we talking about NATO? The Soviet Union is gone. So this old view of we have the East and the West, we don't have that anymore. The Soviet Union is gone. Now you have Russia, which is like a tiny entity compared to the former Soviet Union, which was a superpower like China is. So keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I was almost kicked out of grad school. The article I'm most proud of writing was I was in the graduate program for military science and operational studies. And I wrote an op-ed during the war in the former Yugoslavia calling for the disbanding of NATO. And they literally tried to drum me out of that program. So I've been calling, and I actually wrote in that article, if NATO makes it to 100, it was the 50th anniversary of NATO, how many of us will make it to 50? And I'm 51 now, and here we go. You literally, the New York Times several months ago, as you know, wrote an article saying we have an inordinate fear of nuclear war. Sean Penn went on CNN and said a nuclear war isn't that bad. It's really, really unbelievable. So John and I don't really disagree on substantially, but what my point is that Russia's brutal. They're shutting down the evangelical churches, killing priests, raping priests, putting landmines around schools. And we have the Wagner Group now in Sudan that's creating a menace and killing Christians. We lost an employee in my organization rescuing Christians in Sudan 3 weeks ago, was killed shot by a Wagner Group sniper. So Russia's a menace, and NATO is a problem as well. And we as Christians in the United States need to take the hard line of standing with the people of Ukraine for Ukraine, which is a negotiated peace. And I don't know why we don't hear anyone, left or right or in between, really, why are we not banging drums for peace? And I think the reason is there's a lot of money to be made, thousands of grifters making thousands of small decisions to put money in their pockets. And we as Christians, my organization, the Vulnerable People Project, is to stand with the vulnerable when the world abandons them. It is really unbelievable. It's the Brave New World versus Animal Farm. And I'm a Christian, and I look to the body of Christ, and we need to be at the cross with the vulnerable. You did one of the most beautiful things, and you let me have a Yazidi woman who had recently been rescued from ISIS. We had her on your show. During the war against ISIS, I was with the Peshmerga traveling in Iraq during those battles to liberate Mosul and liberate the Christians and Yazidis that had been held prisoner by ISIS. When I asked a very influential woman who was effectively a princess of a minority group called the Kakai, I had asked her if she met with the U.S. State Department. And this young woman from a very small minority group that most Iraqis would never meet someone who's Kakai. I asked her, did you meet with the U.S. State Department? She said, yes. They told us ethnic minority issues weren't a priority for us. LGBTQ issues were. Now, this was during the Obama administration, during a genocide of a very small community. They're being wiped off the earth, and a State Department official could look them in the eye and say this. Well, I was in Kyiv. Every night missiles fell on the city, and every night U.S. Weapon systems intercepted those missiles. Could you imagine? And I had a lot of meetings, and I promised to keep a lot of those meetings that I wouldn't share what we discussed, but I can share this much. Imagine that our support for defensive weapon systems to protect civilians from incoming fire would be linked to reforms, to quote unquote progressive reforms on abortion, same-sex marriage, and trans issues. It's really unbelievable. And when a Ukrainian government official asked me what they can do to push back against this, I said, there's nothing you can do. There's nothing.
This is called blackmail. This is satanic blackmail. I mean, it's an amazing thing that the might of the United States of America, ladies and gentlemen, this is what your tax dollars are paying for, pushing an insane LGBTQ agenda. It's insane in this country, and we're trying to export it. This country used to export liberty, the gospel of Jesus Christ. We used to do that. But we know increasingly in latter decades, we've been pushing abortion and all this other stuff, pushing it hard. And I'm glad you're bringing this out. I'm glad you wrote about it at the stream. Eric,
I was very proud to see those missiles intercepted, And I never even went into the bomb shelter. I just put the pillow over my head when the sirens went off and went back to sleep. But because I had faith in our weapon systems, I was very proud of that. But I had an intense shame to think that the deal is unravel your culture. A country that doesn't have this movement, it's unimaginable. It's sorrowful. General Milley said, you may recall this, in the early weeks of the war, when he was asked if victory was possible, and he said out loud, "Our goal is not victory. Our goal is a quagmire." Congratulations to General Milley.
Wait a minute. General Milley, who's a bum, actually said that?
Yeah, a bum. Yeah, it's unbelievable because he's a general. I was a soldier. I hate war. My son fought against. I opposed Zmirak, and our friendship bonded on. I was chairman of the Young Republicans and opposed the invasion of Iraq, which at the time took tremendous courage if I actually cared about other people's opinions, which I didn't. But I cared about what was right. And my son ended up fighting in Iraq and Syria against ISIS. I hate war. I've smelled burning flesh. I've seen children with holes in their heads scattered across the sand of Iraq. I hate war. I look at a T-72 tank that Ukrainians probably show as part of their successes. But I think of the Russian soldier that was melted inside that tank, his child and his wife. I went to the hospitals in Ukraine, and hospitals, Eric, huge. It was a former prison, and every room has a young man whose legs, arms, or eyes are gone. The day I stepped foot off the train in Kyiv, the very moment I stepped foot, I called one of my partners, Ryan Hendrickson, who's doing landmine removal with tip of the spear line landmine removal. He was supposed to meet me in Kyiv. I called him. He was out of breath. I assumed he was in the hotel gym on a treadmill. When I finally got a hold of him, this brave man, former Army Green Beret, had his leg blown off in Afghanistan and is now removing landmines in Ukraine. Actually, they decided to stay 12 more hours outside of Kharkiv removing landmines, and another one of his men, an American, stepped on a landmine and lost his leg. He was carrying a 220-pound man on his back with a leg that was reattached after 26 surgeries, was out of breath. This is what war is. It's young men losing their lives, young children losing their fathers, boys with hopes and dreams melting inside of tanks. And we have thugs in Russia and thin-souled, thin-lipped, mocha latte drinking bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., the same people that abandoned our allies in Afghanistan to death.
This is tough stuff because, like you're saying, there's no good guys, bad guys. There's just people that are suffering. I think the same in China. I mean, that the Chinese communist government is as evil as it gets, but the people of China are the ones that are suffering. You mentioned that our government is pushing this globalist, pansexual agenda on countries like Ukraine. It really seems like something out of an end time novel. Why would our government be doing this? Why would the forces of evil be embedded in our government, using the power of the United States of America to push unbiblical views, whether on abortion or on sexuality? Why do you suppose they push this so hard? Why is this so important to our State Department, to the people doing this?
Well, I'm Catholic, and Kyiv and Moscow play the center stage and Catholic prophecies on end times. So there's that. But I think Hannah Arendt said it best in her essay on the Eichmann trial, which is it's the banality of evil. It's small people who are thoughtless, who are trying to impress their supervisors to get a little promotion, to keep their job, to make sure their 401k is intact. I met with an American in Ukraine who wanted to talk to me more about weapon systems and Raytheon than the people of Ukraine. And it was really, I was embarrassed and my heart was broken. We used to be the city on a hill. We're still on the hill. Unfortunately, the lights are off, except for the disco ball, and we've lowered our flag and we've put up the rainbow flag. But I really do think there's a reason to the rhyme of the LGBT ideology. I think it is an instrument of imperialism, colonialism. It is designed to disrupt communities, to make them more accessible and open to exploitation. We see this in Africa. We see this in Eastern Europe. We see this in Asia, in Central and South America. That rainbow flag is neoliberal imperialism designed to break down societies, to make them easier to exploit, designed to divide us. Look, this war is dividing American conservatives. This war is dividing conservatives in the United States from Europe. Of course, in Poland and Hungary now has sort of been excommunicated from the rest of the conservative world in Europe. The Poles and other European conservatives are upset with Americans for not supporting this war enough. You have China really at the center of this. They signed an agreement of unlimited partnership with Russia the day before the invasion. The same China that has its deals with the Taliban. The same China that yesterday met with Blinken, and he threw Taiwan under the bus. This is really unbelievable.
Now, I didn't hear about this. That the Chinese leadership yesterday met with our Secretary of State Blinken, who threw Taiwan under the bus. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, he said that he does not support an independent Taiwan.
Is that a new point of view from our Department of State? Is that a new point of view?
It's a new way of wording. He could have just said we support a one China policy. But what he said is we do not support an independent Taiwan. That reminds me of when Bob Dole went and met with Saddam Hussein and said, we don't care if you invade Kuwait. How is this not going to lead to a war? It so shocked me that I emailed my team immediately and said, we need to open up a Taiwan office for the Vulnerable People Project. Let's get ahead of a conflict for the first time. We're always chasing our tail, we got involved in Ukraine when a religious order of nuns shared with us that the invasion led to the kidnapping and sexual exploitation of orphan girls from the East. So we set up shelters in the West. And then Ryan Hendrickson asked us to help them with trucks and landmine removals to remove landmines. That's how we got pulled into Ukraine, and then distributing food and insulin and other things. It's really sorrowful when I support a unipolar world where we're at the top. I don't see how any other model leads to anything but constant wars and conflicts. But unfortunately, we've given away any hope of being able to fulfill that role responsibly. And we become as part of the problem. We see this in Sudan, Eric. I mean, the world's not paying attention to what's happening in Sudan, Uganda, Nigeria. 9 out of 10 Christians murdered this year are going to be murdered in Nigeria. Just yesterday in Uganda, 46 Christians were slaughtered. China's disappearing Christians left and right. We have 7 Catholic bishops who have been disappeared by the CCP, gone. No one knows where they are. Not a peep from the Vatican, not a peep from the church.
Now, why not a peep from the Vatican? What could that possibly? You're Catholic. How is it possible? Because I know the situation in China is complicated in the sense that you have an underground church, a real church, and then you have some people that have kind of made their peace with the communist regime. When you say that there are 7 Catholic bishops that have disappeared in China, is this because they are outspoken against atheist communism and the communist leadership?
I'm so glad you asked this question. First of all, it's sort of flipped. The patriotic church there's no more underground church. The Vatican recognizes the quote unquote patriotic church effectively, and the CCP gets to choose bishops. No, several of these bishops, like Bishop Melchior, was disappeared for providing care to disabled orphan children, for teaching them to pray, for giving sacraments to the children, for giving them religious education. Under the Vatican deal, they're not allowed to give children the sacraments or religious education until they're 18. So they made the horrible mistake of taking in and caring for disabled, unwanted, discarded children, and doing the radically subversive act of teaching disabled children how to worship their creator. And there's really silence. But Eric, this should be the one guy and you've helped me see this with your book Bonhoeffer, and Rene Girard helped me see this in his writings. This is not unusual. Girard said, whenever these mimetic contagions of tyranny and violence erupt, Christians say, we thought we were different. None of us are different. This isn't different. We're just like them. They're just like us. And why maladjusted weirdos like Eric Metaxas and John Zmirak and Jason Jones don't get swept away by mimetic contagions. And I feel When I was in Ukraine,
I want to hang on a second. This is such a big point. When we come back, we got to explore what you just said. We'll be right back talking to Jason Jones. So you were just talking about a number of bishops, Catholic bishops in China, who disappeared because they were being too Catholic.
Yeah, they were just doing what bishops are supposed to do: make sure that Christians receive the sacraments and receive Christian formation. And they were arrested. And in the case of Bishop Melchior, he had done it for decades for unwanted, discarded, and abandoned disabled street children. I couldn't think of anything more noble or more beautiful.
All right, look, there's no doubt about this, that it's noble, beautiful, it's Christian. The question is, why doesn't the Vatican stand strongly? If John Paul II were Pope, this, it seems to me, would be a different story than what we have now under Francis.
Yeah, there's a beautiful interview from Stanford University that has a television show at the Hoover Institute, and they interviewed Rene Girard in 2012. And he had talked about Peter's denial, and that Peter got swept away by the crowd and even denied Christ. Peter, as Catholics, we believe is the first pope. He said, Girard said, I see this as sort of a prophecy. He said, it might sound hard to believe, but imagine if one day we have a pope who's swept away by a mimetic contagion to abandon the scapegoat to stand with the powerful.
Okay, this is Rene Girard lingo. I think people can track a mimetic what?
Contagion.
Contagion,
so
yeah.
We've all felt it. We've all experienced it. We've all been a part of a crowd. We can feel it move us. We can, Peter, when he denied Christ, he was in a crowd. And it was a young woman specifically, which Girard points out probably is pretty important in the whole story. So to be able to stand up against the crowd with the victim is the practical life of the Christian. That is what we are called to do. Never abandon the vulnerable. That is what restrains catastrophes in society. We kiss lepers. We tend to prostitutes. We hang out with tax collectors. Whoever society shuns, it is our vocation to care for and to love. And so when I was in Ukraine, of course, one of my jobs in the military is I was an anti-tank scout in a light infantry unit. And so I had to memorize, I fired the AT-4 anti-tank weapon system at the time, and I had to memorize every Soviet tank. This was before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I knew every Soviet tank. Every silhouette I shot at had a hammer and sickle on it. So of course, when I see a burned out T-72 tank, I can feel this mimetic contagion pulling on me. And whenever this happens, I'm very grateful for it because it gives me empathy. We should never be shocked when we see people we love swept away by the crowd. And if we're not swept away, it's just the mystery of grace. And that's all. And you know what? Just because we weren't swept away by this contagion doesn't mean, for example, COVID-19 was a perfect example of all of that. And just because we weren't swept away today doesn't mean we can't be swept away tomorrow.